Hello, nice to see you. Before I start, a small disclaimer, I have a terrible cold, so sorry in advance for any additional sound effects, but I will try to make it up to you with the content of this talk. We'll be talking about stories and about games, about stories and about gameplay, and every story is a journey, so let's take a look at the road ahead of us. We'll start with some introductions, who am I and why I'm actually making this talk, what we'll be talking about. Then we'll take a look on how stories work, and probably we'll learn something or notice something interesting about the structure of stories. And then we will compare stories and gameplay mechanisms, and I hope that we'll learn something from it, and then we'll try to use this knowledge we gained to take storytellers look on some gameplay mechanisms, to look on gameplay through the lens of storytelling, and hopefully we'll reach some conclusions. We will combine what we noticed, and I'll try to present you a hypothesis of narrative-driven game design. So let's start with some introductions. I'm talking from my experience, and my experience is mainly being story and game designer. I have some background in data analysis, but mostly I was telling stories using games. I started in CD Projekt Red, working on The Witcher, then I worked on mobile games, then I made a prototype of a new game for 11-bit studios, and I am also teaching story and game design at Łódź University of Technology. So this is my background, and it influences the topics I'm interested in. And direct inspiration for this talk was this great book by John Yorke. The book is called Into the Woods, How Stories Work and Why We Tell Them, and the book is about stories, mainly in television and in movies, but it inspired me to take a fresh look at how stories work in games and in gameplay, and the parts of this talk that are dealing directly with stories are based on what John Yorke wrote into the Woods. So it's a great book, and if you have an opportunity, go and read it. And I was working on many stories in games, and I noticed that there are some questions that keep popping in my mind. The first one was how to tell stories in games. Then I tried to rephrase and started wondering how good are games for telling stories? Is it a good medium for telling stories? Then I thought, how can I use gameplay mechanism to tell stories? And how to design stories in game to make the best of the medium, because the medium is different than books or movies. But lately I noticed that the main question that I'm thinking about while working on stories is how to use our knowledge of stories to make better games. And this is what this talk is actually about. I will try to take a look with you at how stories work, and then we'll try to apply the knowledge to the area of making games. So, how do stories work? We'll be looking for some meaning underneath all stories. And we'll start with a story. So let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was someone normal, living a normal life, and then it became clear that our hero is lacking something vital, something important. And the hero went for a journey to find what was missing. And it appeared that to get to the treasure, to win the treasure, the hero had to face a grave and deadly danger. The odds seemed impossible, but our hero overcame the opposition, and he or she won, and returned home with a prize that restored the balance. And does the story sound familiar? Well, I think yes, because that's basically every story ever told. Of course, sometimes it's a literal journey, like in The Hobbit, there and back again. Sometimes it's a metaphorical journey, an introspection. Sometimes the thing that is lacking is a physical thing, something, it's an emotion, a knowledge about ourselves or a knowledge about the world. Sometimes it's a person. Sometimes the danger is a literal dragon. Sometimes it's doubt or our own flaws. And the balance at the end may be a happy balance or a tragic balance. But basically, this is every story ever written. And of course, there are many stories that break this mold, that break the structure. But even if they break the structure, we know that this is the structure they are breaking. So yeah, this is a basic story. And we can take another look at every story. Every story, and Aristotle started doing this. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and the end. The middle is the thing, between the beginning and the end. We know the beginning because before the beginning nothing interesting happens, and we know the end because after the end nothing interesting happens. And we like stories that have something unexpected between the beginning and middle, and between the middle and the end. So that's another take on stories. And we can draw a dramatic arc of almost every story when first the character is called to action and has some initial success. Then there is this crisis, this decision, this midpoint in the mid of the story. Then usually things start to go wrong, or some bad things start happening, and then there's the victory or defeat. And this was the basic 5-act structure that we can impose over every story. And I know that, formally speaking, there can be 3 acts or 7 acts. That depends on the medium. But the formal division between acts is based on many other factors. Like in 17th century, in the Shakespearean times, the length of an act was based on how often candles have to be replaced. And in the opera, the length of an act is more based on how often the audience had to go to the loo. And in the television today, the number of acts is more or less connected with how often we can put advertisements in our entertainment. But under these formal divisions, there are 5 things that happen in almost every story. First, there's exposition, when we learn the characters taking place in the story, and we learn something about the nature of the conflict. Then there are some complications, intrigues, clash of interests, something starts to happen. Then there's climax, and the hero is at the crossroads. There is this key knowledge, key decision, the moment when we know whether our hero is a hero or a coward. And there is falling action that are consequences of the climax. There are some false hopes, false fears, and all it's leading either to catastrophe and downfall, like in the Greek tragedies, or to victory and transfiguration, like in Hollywood movies, most of them. And we can use this structure to track almost everything that is happening within the story. For example, many characters have this mask hiding their true self, and usually at the beginning of the story, the mask is all we see, and at the end of the story, we see their true nature. Or hero wants something, but needs something completely different, and at the beginning of the story, the hero has only desire, and at the end of the story, the hero accepts what he or she really needs. Or first, the opposition is stronger than the hero, and then the hero wins. Or when we are dealing with tragedies like Macbeth, at the beginning, the hero has upper hand and is defeated at the end. Or perceived difficulty of the task versus hero skill, or ignorance versus knowledge. They all track more or less, and the moment of balance, the moment when everything is revealed, is usually in the middle of the 3rd act. And if you are reading every story or every book, try to take notice what happens in the middle, like when you're reading on the Kindle, when there's 50% of the book read, just try to see what's happening, and usually this is the moment when the true nature of something is revealed. Because it's all, under all stories there is the same hero's journey, and there are some formalized approach to this, like the Campbell's monomyth, but it's just one of the instances of hero's journey. Usually it's something like this, that at the beginning the hero has no knowledge, something happens and the knowledge starts to grow, and the hero awakens. Then there's doubt, hero overcomes the reluctance and accepts the mission, experiments a bit, and then in the middle of the story there's this breakthrough, this crisis, and key knowledge is revealed. And then hero experiments having that knowledge, that key knowledge, and in the fourth act usually there's doubt, growing reluctance, maybe regression, and in the fifth act there's reawakening, the hero re-accepts the role of a hero and achieves total mastery. And why this story shape is so universal? Why we can take almost every story and find this shape beneath the story? Because this is how our brain learns things. We have a problem, we react to the problem, and there are consequences that brings us to a solution. Or if we are more academically inclined, there's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So what I think and what John Yorke wrote in his book is that stories are the tool our brain uses to make sense of a chaotic universe. That is the trait that helped us survive for the last millennia, that we look at data, look at the world, and we see the shape of stories, and thus the stories are there for us to learn. This is the tool we use to bring order to a universe that is, chaotic. And we think in stories. There was this experiment that made by Kuleshov. He was a Russian filmmaker from 100 years ago, and he filmed an actor staring into a camera and make 3 short films. The actor, and then it was edited with a dead girl in coffin. The same actor looking at camera, and then there was this bowl of soup, and the same actor and beautiful lady, beautiful by the standards 100 years ago. And when he was showing the 3 films to different people, in the first film, the audience said, "Oh, you can see the sadness in his eyes. The man is sad because the girl died." In the second film, the audience said, "Oh, we can feel his hunger. He's so hungry. He's looking at the soup, and he wants to eat it." And in the third film, they said, "Oh, he's a lusty bastard. He desires the girl. We can feel it." But this footage of the actor was the same in every movie. It was just a guy with a blank expression staring at the camera, because our brain interprets sequences of data and gives them motivation, gives them emotion. We see a guy and that girl, and we understand the situation as, "Oh, so he's sad because he's looking with this intense expression at the girl." But the guy was not doing this. It was happening in the brains of observers. So that is what we do. We look at data and we try to fit them into the shape of a story, which will come really handy for us as game designers. Because let's now try and take a look on how stories compare to gameplay. And there will be something about fractals also, because fractals are quite cool. And this is the basic gameplay loop. We have an objective. There's a challenge between us and the objective, and if we win, there's a reward. So we have a problem, we react to the problem, and there's a solution. And the shape should be quite familiar for us, because this is the shape of a story. This is the shape of our brain's learning process. And it's quite natural, because to master a game, our brain has to make sense of a new world. Yeah? Every game is a new world with a new set of rules, and our brain has to understand it. So our brain needs stories to understand how to play a game. And if every one of you played the game, Jonathan Blow's game called The Witness, you probably know what you are talking about, what I'm talking about. This is basically the game about learning a new set of rules. Quite a brilliant game, by the way. So how do we put stories in gameplay if we need them so much? So, yeah, they are already there. Games are a set of data, so our brain will see narratives. will create motivation, will attribute emotions. So every game creates a story. Even Tetris creates a story in our mind, a story about success or about a failure. So can we prevent from stories being into games or games having stories inside? We probably cannot prevent it because of the Kuleshov effect. So now we can just focus on putting the right stories into games, on working on the knowledge that people see stories everywhere and try to use the knowledge to make better and more engaging games. So let's take a look at a story from up till down. Like we'll be zooming to lower and lower levels of a story. So usually a story is about a complete change. There's an exposition, crisis in the midpoint, and there are some consequences leading to resolution. And when we zoom in, there are acts. Every act is about a major change in a character or in the world. So there's usually a setup, some kind of a journey, more or less metaphorical, leading to a climax and resolution. And when we zoom in, every act consists of scenes dealing with minor changes. Every scene is basically a conflict leading to a turning point, and if the pacing is right, the turning point is a cliffhanger setting up the next scene and the next conflict. But when we zoom in even more, we see a basic exchange of every story, which is action and reaction. I tell something and my opponent reacts to it. I see something and I react. So a story is a fractal. At every level, it's basically the same shape. And games, well, are the same, because a basic game starts with an exposition, some tutorial, the moment when the world is presented to us. Then there is this journey of growing difficulties, growing stakes, and at the end, it's either a resolution or a plateau of the end game. We have the total mastery of the game. And when we zoom in, every game consists of levels or quests or missions. We have an objective. There's a moment of exploration or struggle, and there's a final challenge leading to a resolution. But when we zoom in, there's usually an encounter, a single challenge. That is a challenge that ends in a win state or fail state, and if the pacing is good, it usually leads to another challenge. And then when we zoom in, there is second-to-second gameplay, which is basically action and reaction. I'm playing Mario, there's a hole in the ground, and I have to react to it. Yeah? So there's this fractal nature of stories and games, and when we compare them, we can see that game is a story, and act is a lever or a mission. A scene is more or less an encounter, and a bit is second-to-second gameplay. And at every level of this fractal, there's a hero that faces a problem, reacts to find a solution. So the big story is a big problem, big reactions and big solution, and sometimes at the beginning it's a conversation or a moment of a fight, so basic action and reaction. And we can see from this that probably to tell a good story we need a hero of some kind, someone who reacts and learns. And let's take a step back. In stories there are basically two types of a hero. There's a three-dimensional hero who has true self hidden behind a mask. So he pretends or she pretends to be one thing, but really is another. And the hero desires one thing, but usually needs something different, usually the opposite. And the hero has a flaw, and the flaw can be his or her downfall, can be fatal. And the hero must confront own flaws and discover the true self hiding behind the mask. And the hero changes. That is the main feature of a three-dimensional hero. So the hero usually lasts just for one story. After the change is completed, there is nothing interesting to say about the hero. But such kind of a hero is deeply, deeply satisfying when done right. And there is a two-dimensional hero who is transparent, needs no mask. He is as, or she is as she looks like. What the hero desires is what the hero needs. And what he lacks is knowledge. So the only deficiency in the hero is usually a lack of knowledge. And the hero must confront not inner demons, but outside opposition, and does not discover the true self, but reasserts who she or he is. And the hero stays the same, so it's perfect for serious sequels and highly addictive when done right. My perfect two-dimensional hero is Sherlock Holmes. Yeah? He's the best detective. He solves crimes, needs to solve crimes, so he doesn't know who's the villain, then he knows who's the villain, and he reasserts the fact that he's the world's finest detective. So what makes a hero? And I'll tell you the beginning of 4 stories. So imagine a bar woman walks up to a man who's drinking alone, and the woman says, and let's put a cliffhanger here. We don't know what she said. Or a boy is bullied at school and finds a magic lamp and asks the djinn for, we don't know for what the question was, not yet. Or a man loses his family in an accident, and one day he wakes up and decides. Or a huntress stands at the entrance of a cave, and she sniffs the air, and we don't know whether she enters or runs away. And can we empathize with those heroes? Do we know if we like them, if we can vote for them? Probably not yet, because we don't know what kind of heroes they are. Because what makes a hero unique is the decision made in a moment of crisis. A huntress who enters the cave is a different hero than a huntress who runs away. So we need decisions or a hero in every story needs decisions to show us what kind of hero he or she is. And what is unique for the medium we are working in for games is that in game that decision is usually made by the player, and we will go back to this, but this is, I think, an important part. So we noticed that there is an analogy between stories and gameplay, that gameplay has the same shape as a basic story, and they both reflect how our brain learns new things. So let's take that knowledge and take a look at some gameplay mechanisms chosen quite arbitrarily to see if the theory works. So we'll focus on character development, audience engagement, satisfaction, and subverting expectations, on motivations, empathy, dialogues, and emergent narratives. It will be just a quick look on every of those facets of a game. So let's take a look at character development. What we usually have in game is two-dimensional approach. Most of game characters are two-dimensional. It's not a bad thing. Just it's like more of a statistics. And such hero gains experience. Sometimes it's literally called experience, and learns new skills. Sometimes they are literally called skills. And this kind of character development is about increasing knowledge. But it's not about a true change. In an RPG, a paladin on the 10th level is not a different person than a paladin on the first level. He's just better at being a paladin. And in long-running TV series, we have this thing called Jumping the Shark, where every story has been told about the characters, and the writers have to reach for really bizarre conclusions or ideas to keep the audience engaged. And in games, we usually have this thing that's called power creep, that when our hero is powerful enough, nothing is really interesting in the game anymore. And both of those problems stem from the same idea, that the character can be only better and can be more of who he is. So this kind of thing requires occasional amnesia. In long-run TV series, it happens from time to time. In some games I've been working on, well, like The Witcher started with an amnesia because the character was not usable after the books. He had to be reset to be interesting. And from one Witcher, from Witcher 1 to Witcher 2 to Witcher 3, the Geralt forgot all his skills. Yeah, he started every game now knowing nothing about being a witcher, and we as players probably even didn't notice that, because that's what we expect from the genre. But this is, you know, conscious decision on the part of the developers to make the character forget, to make place for development, for new knowledge. And we have also three-dimensional approach, mostly in story games, like, for example, Life is Strange. Then the character makes decision and lives through the consequences of those decisions. And then the character development in such games is usually the progress in the story. If you play it, but it's not increasing mastery. If you play it Life is Strange, at the end of the game, the character had different relations with other characters, learned something as a person, but she was not faster, stronger, or she didn't even graduate from a college. So this is a different kind of development, of growth. And what sometimes is a problem in such games is that when in a story a character is torn between the desire and the need, in games usually the need is the character, but the desire is the player. The character needs to save the world and save the princess, let's say Zelda, but the player wants to go fishing and collect all the flowers. And the story starts to breaking apart, because if we control this arc between desire and need, we have a good story, but we cannot control the player. So this is something to be taken into account. In Life is Strange Before the Storm, there was a nice approach to this, because there was a collectible element into the game, but you collected graffiti made by the main character. So it was the player's desire to collect things, where the character's desire to destroy things or to attack. So that was a nice approach. And what is tricky is that the growth of the character relies on player's decision. And if we do it right, it will be satisfying. But if players decide to do something else than we planned, that can be a problem. So what can we do to keep our players engaged, to make them care for the story and for the character? Well, most of people learn to earn their entertainment, to work for it, and effort put into a work of art, let's say, or a commercial product of culture increases involvement. So we have an upper hand as game designers, because people like to put effort into games. And we can use something that is called 2 + 2 = rule. That is, we do not give the player answers, and instead of answers, we ask very simple questions. It's not like square root of 174 equals rule, but 2 + 2 = rule. So we do not explicitly say, I hate you, or I'm afraid to tell you that I love you, but we make the situation so that it is obvious. And then players goes, I'm clever. Yeah, I deduced it. The same goes as for puzzle games, and yeah. And what is good for us is that gameplay is a high engagement activity, and when we use it as storytelling tool, we will keep the players involved. And we can use something that is used that is called system rhetorics, and it works like this: when I am making a game, I am not modeling the world. I am modeling what I think about the world. So I make a set of rules, but or a system, but I am the one putting numbers into it. So players interacting with the system will learn my opinion about the world. For example, in Frostpunk, we can balance the system that, for example, eating dead people is not a good strategy, or is a strategy that is good only in some circumstances, and the moral of the story will be probably it's not a good thing to eat dead people. But if we put different numbers into the same systems, the moral would be, oh, eating people is great. Yeah, and neither of the system is a direct shadow of the world. It's a decision made by designers. So we can use systems to tell stories, and we'll talk about it a bit more later. So, but this kind of engagement requires that the player is curious, that the player is willing to explore the world, to explore the systems. And so fear in such games is our enemy. When we punish players for trying, for experimenting, they will close up and will not learn. So that is something to keep in mind. And we can also subvert expectations. We can make something different. We can make some changes to the story structure. And the most common thing is dark inversion. So what hero perceives as his flaw or her flaw is in fact his virtue. So Don Corleone in Godfather, at the beginning of the story, he was a good man, but he had to kill the good man inside to become a good crime lord, a successful crime lord. So in dark inversion stories, usually the hero through self is evil. So the hero learns that he's not a hero after all, or she that she's a villain. And usually such kind of a story ends in a catastrophe, like Breaking Bad, Macbeth, or the original God of War series. And we can also disturb the structure. Like, have you seen No Country for Old Men? It's a movie when the main character is killed off screen, and it's sudden, and we don't know what to do. So we can make a story where parts of the character arc of the story sharp are missing or are misplaced. And the surprise and this dissonance creates very strong emotions. So we care for such stories. Like Pulp Fiction was a very traditional story, but it was told in a different order. So that was that was one of the things that kept me interesting when I was watching the movie. And in games, we use it a lot. We use it a lot, so we don't even see that we are using it. The fail and reload system is breaking the structure. It's like, many thousand years ago, a storyteller sitting by a campfire and talking to children and saying, and then the wolf ate me and he killed me. And the audience was, wow, but you're alive. Yeah, I was kidding. I cut myself from the belly of the wolf, and here I am, reborn. So this is a trick that was used for millennia, and we are using this in game. I'm playing God of War, I die, and there's this, and it's written, you died, and I reload, and the death was not really, it was just, I don't know, a jump scare, a possibility. It was a disturbance in the structure of the story. And we use it a lot, and we don't even see it. So this is, I think, one of the moments when we can try to do something more interesting, maybe, and use it consciously. But this, when it's overused or mishandled, it causes frustration. Like if I die very often, and it's not the Dark Souls series, I'm usually frustrated and stop playing. Or when I finish Mass Effect 3, and the great payoff is a different color of explosions, which is breaking the structure, but it's also a frustrating element. So this have to be handled carefully. And we can take a look at motivations and empathy. People empathize with vibrant, breathing, living characters. And how can we make sure that we have such characters? Well, firstly, we as designers have to really believe in our character's motivation, but we also have to understand the antagonist, what the antagonist wants and why. Sometimes it's just, oh, he's a bad guy, and that's everything. So the hero has to be empathetic, but the opposition also should to be empathetic. And if you can, in every moment of a game, tell how your opponent feels, what the opponent emotions are, you probably have a really good game that is a really good story. And there are some red flags to watch for. First, if characters in cutscenes are very different than characters in the gameplay. For example, Far Cry series, I am a killing machine in gameplay, and then I got disarmed at the beginning of every cutscene. There are like inconsistent character who he really is. I am not really sure. Is he a killing machine or a scared student? It doesn't add up. Sometimes important decisions are made for the player, not by the player. This is also a thing to watch for. And when there are scenes in games, and it happens when only motivations for anyone at the scene stems from gameplay, like, oh, this is our gameplay graph and we need combat here. And if we just put combat here and don't think for a moment about the motivations, it's probably something to avoid. And there are dialogues in games, a very powerful tool, but hard to use. I won't be talking about editing or all the writing stuff. I will just present you an idea that you can think of a conversation as an action scene. And dialogues that are action scenes are, in my opinion, the only that should appear in games. In such a dialogue, we use the opposition to present a dilemma, a problem, and then use the dilemma to characterize both character and the opposition. And dialogues in games, in many games, have choices that player can make, and that's a great thing, because in a dialogue, in a conflict, what we say shows our mask, but the choices we make, the actions we do, reveals something about who we really are. So we can think of dialogues in games as a way of presenting the player with a spectrum of how much the player wants to expose the character or learn the character. And we can use the scenes to prepare the player for a change or a revelation. So every dialogue is a conflict to characterize the opponent and the hero, and to prepare scene for a revelation or a change. And we can also make players work for the entertainment, so never write for. Like, don't be the James Bond villain who stands and has this expose about what he wants to do. It's better for the player to just deduce it from the whole game before the scene. And we can use the Kuleshov effect, especially in dialogues that are composed of different parts that are very interactive, that even if the writing will be not so great and consistent at every path of the dialogue, usually players in their heads will fill in the gaps with their emotions, their thing, their opinion of the motivations of the characters taking place or taking part in the dialogue. So it can help us a bit. And if you can skip dialogue, like The Witcher 3 or all Witchers and dialogues with merchants. And for example, this War of Mine, when the merchant didn't have a dialogue, just had this interface of bargaining or of bartering that conveyed all the emotions we needed in that scene, and no text was used. And we can motivate players with surprises, unexpected emotions, and new knowledge. So that's tools, some set of tools that we can use. And now let's talk about emergent narratives. So I think that when we talk about games, we never talk about the game. We usually are talking about ourselves, what happened to us while we were playing the game. In many games, there are random sequences of events that we interpret as our stories. Yeah, in survival games like Don't Starve, it happens all the time. Oh, I was building the camp, and then the giant came and destroyed the camp just before the winter came, and I died. And was it a story? Yeah, for me it was a story, very emotional. But was it scripted? It was not scripted. but I'm telling you about the story. So even if we have a game that has a sequence of events, and the events can be seen by the player in different order, it is enough to have different emotions. The order in which we are experiencing parts of the game can color our emotion, our understanding of the motivation, our sympathy to some characters. So it's a very interesting thing. And well, the thing with emergent narratives is that they are impossible to track. I don't know what happened, for example, to you when you were playing Grand Theft Auto, unless you decided to write about it on the internet. But I know that you probably have this experience. And we can enhance user stories, these personal emergent user stories, by feeding the game commentaries to or feedback to player choices and player states. And this, for example, I'm buying a new gun, and there's a bark, AI bark, oh, that's a big gun, or run, he's got this big gun. And this is just some procedural stuff that we do. But when I'm playing, I have this story, oh, I bought this great gun, and now he is afraid of the gun. Yeah, nothing changed in the game except from one AI bark, but I have a story that's there and wasn't there before. And why should we even care? Because I think that the more emergent stories there are in the game and the more personal stories there are in the game, the better the game sells, or at least the more people hear about the game, because people are talking about what happens to them. So this is something to keep in mind. And so yeah, so we noticed that stories and gameplay are similar. Then we tested this hypothesis, looking through a storytelling lens at some arbitrarily chosen gameplay mechanism. So now let's try to compile the knowledge and find an answer to a question: is my story a good game, or is my game a good story? So what players need? Usually players need a good players need a good story, and a good story needs a theme, a question that the story answers, or the question that the story asks. So we start with a question, and people assume something. Oh, this is a game about survival. I think it will be hard. And then I explore. I go, pick up stuff, engage with the systems, and I challenge that assumption. Yeah, it's hard. Oh, no, it's not hard after all. You just have to be clever. And then there's an answer, a conclusion. Like when we synthesize what we learn, probably it could be like, oh, yeah, surviving is hard, or being smart is a good move when you want to survive. And, you know, the answer is not universal. Like there's always an author. The answer is always provided by someone. And there's a spectrum. We can design the answer, like make a game that proves a certain point. We want to say something, to say that we think that, for example, I don't know, wars are terrible, and we make a game to prove that point. Or we can present a number of answers and let the players choose. So we are half authors. We just present a spectrum, and the player is the author of the story, of the outcome of the story. Or we can make a system, and that's it. We put our thoughts into the system. The system is designed to make some things possible, but the player's answer is emergent and internal. So that's the spectrum we are working on, but there is always an author. And so what's the basic story or gameplay building block? How to make sure that this particular gameplay mechanism makes a good story? Well, first, we start with the discovery. So the hero notices something, learns something, and decides to act. The hero or the player, yeah? And then there's a moment of truth at some point. We learn something, the true nature of the opposition, or the hero flaws reveals itself. You know, it could be like the discovery is, oh, there's an orc running at me, and the truth can be, my armor is insufficient. I need better armor, but so it doesn't have to be like something deep, but it has to be there. And then there's this moment of assimilation. So we have to make possible that the player and the hero acts on the knowledge and succeeds or fails. So I have this checklist. I ask myself, for example, what the hero wants, what the opposition wants, and is there a conflict? Conflicts are good. Does the player want the same thing that the hero wants? Where is the moment of choice in my game, in my scene, in my encounter? What is at stake at the moment? Because a choice without a stake is not engaging. What does the hero learn and what does the player learn? That can be two different things. Both are very interesting. And do all actors have a reason to be in this situation? What do they want to gain? When I ask myself the question, I can make sure that they are committed to the scene, and that makes the scene important, or I can just remove the scene. And does the hero change? Does the hero reveal some inner truth? In what way? It's not necessary. The question could be, does the hero reasserts himself or herself? And does the situation end in a setup for a new scene, a cliffhanger? That's great, because this keeps the story flowing. And we can take a look at the game as a scene. And there's a smaller checklist. And the questions are, what does the player expect entering the scene? We enter a scene and encounter a level, and we see something. We expect something. And then we learn something from interacting with the scene. So we can ask ourselves in advance, what do we want the player to learn? What do we want the player to gain from interacting with the scene? And how the player can use the knowledge, the new knowledge, to win the scene, because games are more or less about winning or progressing, so we can plan that. Because there's usually this, especially in games, this universal quest that every story is about a journey and finding of the missing part, its retrieval, and making of something whole. And every gameplay is about a conflict where two opposites clash. This can be Mario and level, or like a monster and the hero. And then the opposites are assimilated. Either someone wins or they find a point of balance, but either way, the conflict is stilled. So this is how stories look and how gameplay look, and these both are facets of the universal learning process, because every story and every game is about making sense of the universe. So we ask a question, test the question against the world, and assimilate what we've learned. And that's basically the takeout from this talk, I think. So what I want to propose to you is this approach, narrative-driven approach to game design. And this is the thought that we can use the universal story structure to create meaningful and exciting games. We start with a question, and we ask ourselves why the question was asked. Why is it important? And it's our theme, motivation for the player. Then we have to make place for learning, for testing, growing, understanding, for the player making decisions, and we have to know what key knowledge can be discovered. And then there should be a place for assimilation, for player experiencing consequences, for feedback loops, for place for internal stories, and for a change of a character, of the world, or of the player, or all of them. So the idea is that we can hijack our brain's learning mechanism and create a new game-specific language to tell engaging, emotional stories. I think that's possible. So when we were looking for a meaning, we could remember that every story has an author. It doesn't have to be the designer. We can use system rhetorics as our authorial voice, and it's something that we can use only in games. And it's a tool worth using. That players need decisions to assert the identity of the hero or of the player, to learn something about themselves, and that internal narratives stem from random chains of events that we see cause and effect everywhere, and we can use it to enhance player internal narratives. And there's this fractal structure when we remember that there's a story, scene, act, scene, and beat, we can make sure that the theme and mood is consistent on every level, and that makes our story stronger. But all these tools I was talking about are just about structure. And structure without meaning is, well, meaningless. So the most important thing is that before we start making a game, we have to make sure that we have something interesting to say. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we have just one or two more short questions, I think we have still some time.
Okay, so you mentioned that like two like most common types of hero character, like the three-dimensional one and the two-dimensional one, and like how in games the two-dimensional character will have most often will have character progression in terms of mechanics, while a three-dimensional one would have story-oriented character development. But do you think it's like, I mean, it's possible, but do you think there's merit to trying to intertwine moments of character progression in a mechanical sense with character development in a storytelling sense, similar to like what, to give a small example of what Dragon Age Inquisition did, where you pick a specialty for your class and this changes how you interact with certain characters?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm thinking about it for the last few months, because I think there's a room for it, like what you said about changing the nature of the character by character development. But I'm not sure what I think about it. I just at the moment just noticed that one is easier and the other is not, and there's probably some. I would like to see a game where this the three-dimensional character is this growth is realized by gameplay mechanisms. But I don't have an example right now. So, but that was a great question. I probably used all the time in the universe for this talk, so maybe you want to go, and we have to make room for the next speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Artur Ganszyniec.